What if your home's foundation held a secret so valuable it could put you at war with your own neighbors? We thought we were just renovating, digging up old soil. Instead, we unearthed ancient artifacts, pieces of history that felt impossibly ours. The shock of the discovery quickly turned to cold fear when the HOA arrived. Not with congratulations, but with a legal demand to seize them, claiming they belonged to the community land. Overnight, our backyard became a battleground. They wanted to erase history and take what was ours. How do you fight a petty HOA when their ultimate weapon is the law itself? The family had settled into the Willow Creek community seeking peace, a place where the lawns were uniformly green and the silence was enforced not by police, but by the watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association. The central character, simply known as Alex, wasn't a troublemaker. They were a quiet, dedicated history enthusiast, drawn to the neighborhood not just for its manicured perfection, but for its hidden, rolling geography. The house itself was a modest, sturdy structure, sitting on one of the oldest and slightly larger lots in the entire development. For years, life had been a comforting cycle of predictability. The HOA dues were paid on time. The mailbox was always the approved shade of matte black. The occasional passive-aggressive newsletter about unauthorized flower species was usually ignored. This was the trade-off for the stability that Willow Creek promised. A little conformity in exchange for order. Alex and their partner, a pragmatic engineer, simply wanted to enjoy their small slice of the American dream, a place to pursue their quiet passions without incident. Alex's true escape, however, lay beneath the surface. For months, a planned renovation of the home's aging foundation had been delayed, not by budget, but by Alex's personal mission. They believed, based on old local records and subtle shifts in the land, that their specific lot might sit on something far older than the 1990s subdivision. It was a secret, personal hunt, involving patient research and small, carefully executed probes into the soil. The engineer partner tolerated this obsession, viewing it as a harmless hobby. The antagonist wasn't a person yet, but an institution. The Willow Creek HOA board, led by a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor was the self-appointed guardian of visual integrity and community standards. She didn't manage the HOA. She embodied it. Her authority was derived from the thick, leather-bound book of covenants and restrictions she treated like a sacred text. She was an ever-present, silent threat, a reminder that every blade of grass was subject to review. The first crack in the peaceful facade came not with a fine, but with a permit request. Alex finally moved forward with the foundation work, filing the necessary paperwork with the HOA as a formality. Eleanor, in her officious capacity, approved the structural integrity plans but included a strange handwritten addendum, a clause referencing a rarely invoked rule about subterranean alterations and the HOA's right to inspect and regulate subsurface materials deemed a common amenity. Alex's partner dismissed it as typical HOA overreach, a boilerplate clause that meant nothing. Alex, however, felt a chill. The digging hadn't even started. Yet the HOA's cold, calculating I was already focused on the ground. The quiet hobby was about to stop being quiet. Something far more ancient, and far more contentious, was stirring beneath the surface. The stage was set, and the peace of Willow Creek was about to be profoundly broken. The silence of Willow Creek shattered the moment the shovel hit something hard. It wasn't the dull resistance of a buried root or a forgotten construction remnant. It was a cold, clear thud that vibrated up Alex's arms. The foundation crew, bored with the mundane work, gathered around the deepening hole. They had been digging for only 2 days. The initial discovery was small, a perfectly smooth, dark piece of worked stone unlike any natural rock in the area. Alex felt a surge of adrenaline, the culmination of months of quiet research. The engineer partner, called over to inspect, tried to rationalize it as an old patio paver, but the texture, the undeniable age of the material, whispered a different truth. Then came the real reveal. As the crew carefully expanded the perimeter, more items emerged. Not just stones, but fragments of pottery, their markings faint yet distinctly human-made. These weren't colonial relics. They suggested a presence far, far older. The scale of the discovery grew with alarming speed. Within hours, a small section of the yard had yielded several complete, unbroken vessels, and, most crucially, a delicate, stylized bone implement. Alex knew immediately this was a matter for professionals, not YouTube. The thrill of history was now mixed with the acute awareness of the responsibility and the danger of the find. The weaponization of the rulebook. The news traveled faster than the soil could be sifted. It wasn't the neighbors who sounded the alarm first. It was the construction workers, mesmerized by the artifacts, who had carelessly taken photos. Within 12 hours, Image 2, Alex looking down at certified HOA letter and email arrived. Its subject line a stark, capitalized demand, immediate cessation of all subterranean activity, violation of Covenant 4.3b. It was Eleanor. The HOA board sentinel had moved. Alex tried to treat it as a bureaucratic inconvenience, drafting a polite response about their intention to notify the state archaeological department. But Eleanor's reaction wasn't bureaucratic. It was territorial. The very next morning, the board sent a formal certified letter citing the obscure addendum about subsurface materials deemed a common amenity. They weren't just demanding the digging stop. They were claiming ownership of whatever was found. The logic was absurd, yet terrifyingly precise. The HOA owned the community land, and while Alex owned the house and the surface of the lot, anything of significant intrinsic value found beneath a certain depth was subject to the HOA's claim, as it represented a potential liability or asset for the community as a whole. This specific covenant, designed decades ago to manage common mineral rights, was now being weaponized against a few pieces of ancient pottery. The first volley of harassment was the fine. Not a warning, but an immediate, non-negotiable $500 daily fine for the unauthorized storage of excavation debris, which was, in fact, the protected site itself. Construction tape went up, but within hours, an HOA representative, a nervous, clipboard-carrying man acting clearly under duress, was placing laminated notices on Alex's lawn. The message was clear: comply or pay until you are bankrupted. The walls close in. Alex attempted to appeal, demanding an in-person meeting. This was Eleanor's domain, and she reveled in the formality. The meeting was not in a comfortable room, but in the stale, overly air-conditioned HOA office, with Eleanor sitting behind a fortress of binders. She didn't look at Alex. She looked at the law. She escalated the threat, explaining that if Alex refused to cooperate, the HOA would seek an injunction to seize control of the lot to secure the community asset. This meant the HOA would physically enter the property, take possession of the artifacts, and potentially charge Alex for the security costs. The fear was no longer about a fine. It was about losing control of their own home. To ratchet up the pressure, Eleanor began citing additional, petty violations. The dust kicked up by the brief excavation was deemed a failure to maintain visual standards, incurring another $100 fine. The security camera Alex installed to monitor the sensitive site was a change to the exterior facade without prior architectural review. Another $250 fine. The weapon was no longer the artifacts. It was the rulebook itself, wielded with relentless precision to create an environment of constant financial and emotional stress. Every letter, every email, every fine was a calculated attempt to break Alex's resolve, forcing them to surrender the ancient discovery. The engineer partner, initially pragmatic, began to crack under the pressure of the mounting debt and the omnipresent threat. The dream of a quiet home was dissolving into a nightmare of petty, localized tyranny. Alex, however, felt a hardening resolve. This was no longer about old bones and pottery. It was about principle and the right to one's own property against an overzealous, power-hungry bureaucracy. The archaeologist and the legal loophole. Alex knew they couldn't fight an army of petty rules alone. They reached out not to a standard property lawyer who simply saw the HOA's airtight rules, but to a specialist. An archaeological lawyer, a person familiar with state and federal laws regarding historical discoveries. This lawyer, a sharp, seasoned woman named Clara, didn't promise victory, but she saw the one, crucial weakness in Eleanor's fortress. The legal loophole was brilliant in its simplicity. The artifacts, once confirmed as genuine and significant by the State Historical Commission, were no longer merely subsurface materials subject to a community covenant. They became state property, protected by federal antiquity laws. The moment a registered state archaeologist stepped onto the property and formally certified the discovery, the HOA's local jurisdiction would be overridden by a superior legal authority. The tension became a race. Alex and Clara worked frantically to expedite the state's official inspection, while Eleanor, smelling the countermove, doubled down. She knew the moment the state got involved, her power would evaporate. She flooded Alex with threats of immediate legal action and a restraining order to prevent the transfer of the artifacts. The climax of the rising action came on a Thursday morning. Alex received two simultaneous notifications. The first, a hand-delivered notice from the HOA attorney. A final, urgent demand to grant the HOA access to secure the common asset, threatening a lawsuit to seize the property's value. The second was an email from Clara. The state archaeologist was scheduled to arrive tomorrow at 9 a.m. The property was now locked in a silent, high-stakes standoff. The fate of the ancient relics and Alex's ability to live peacefully in their own home depended entirely on who arrived first: the HOA's private security detail or the official representative of the state. Collision: the showdown at the foundation. The morning air in Willow Creek was thick, not just with the humidity of the coming summer, but with anticipation. It was the morning of the reckoning. Alex stood alone in the backyard. The deep excavation pit, now a makeshift history site, illuminated by the harsh early sunlight. The tension was a physical pressure, a silent countdown. The state archaeologist was due at 9 a.m. Eleanor, the HOA's relentless enforcer, was due to move at any second. At 8:45 a.m., the first vehicle arrived. It wasn't the state. A sleek, black SUV pulled silently to the curb, followed by a battered white pickup. Two men, clearly private security hired by the HOA, emerged from the SUV. They were solid, impersonal figures in matching tactical polos, carrying clipboards that looked less like legal documents and more like shields. They represented the HOA's escalation, the final physical assertion of dominance. The head security guard strode toward the perimeter, a paper rustling in his hand. It was the temporary restraining order the HOA had sought, demanding immediate, uncontested access to the property to secure the alleged community asset. He didn't speak. He simply held the document out, a silent challenge. This was the moment Alex had prepared for, the point where the petty neighborhood squabble became a high-stakes legal siege. Alex's heart hammered against their ribs. This was the true peak of the abuse of power. The HOA had moved from fines and letters to the attempted physical seizure of their private property, using hired muscle to enforce an absurd, decades-old covenant. It was a terrifying display of localized tyranny. The standoff. The security guard attempted to step past the boundary tape. Alex moved to block him, not with a shout, but with a silent, resolute stance. This was not a moment for dialogue, but for pure physical tension. The guard, trained to handle trespassers, was momentarily thrown by the resident's stillness. He hadn't anticipated such quiet defiance. He began to read the order aloud, his voice monotone, reciting the cold, legalistic language that claimed dominion over the land. As the guard droned on, a subtle movement caught Alex's eye. The HOA President, Eleanor, had arrived. She stood on the sidewalk, positioned to watch the entire operation unfold, her expression a mask of chilly vindication. She wasn't just observing. She was reveling in the impending humiliation of the homeowner who dared defy her book of rules. She represented the smug satisfaction of petty authority finally winning. But just as the security guard made his second, more forceful attempt to breach the perimeter, a very different vehicle rounded the corner. It was a humble, beige sedan, a model of state-issued anonymity, followed closely by a car bearing the discreet seal of a local news station. A surprise insurance policy arranged by Alex's determined lawyer, Clara. The legal bombshell. The occupants of the beige sedan were not aggressive. They were quiet, professional, and held official identification high. It was Dr. Evelyn Reed, the state archaeologist, and a representative from the State Antiquity Preservation Office. Dr. Reed was direct. She walked straight to the edge of the pit, her eyes focused not on the security guards or the HOA president, but on the earth. The moment her foot crossed the property line, the balance of power shifted. The security guard, visibly flustered by the state presence and the camera crew now filming from across the street, paused his demands. He approached Dr. Reed, trying to interpose the HOA's restraining order. Dr. Reed didn't even accept the paper. She delivered the decisive countermove, the legal bombshell, without raising her voice. She simply stated, clearly and firmly, that based on preliminary photographic evidence, and now her immediate on-site observation, the artifacts found beneath the property were of undeniable pre-colonial significance. She declared the site a temporary state-protected historical zone. This declaration was the climax. It instantly invalidated every single one of Eleanor's legal documents, covenants, and fines. The HOA's authority, previously supreme in the miniature kingdom of Willow Creek, was instantly, emphatically subordinated to state and federal law. The obscure, powerful covenant about subsurface materials designed to manage community assets became utterly meaningless when those assets transcended community ownership and became the property of the people, the state. Eleanor's public collapse. The focus of the camera crew and the neighbors who had begun to gather shifted entirely from Alex to Eleanor. The HOA president's rigid composure finally shattered. The vindication in her eyes turned to disbelief, then to naked fury. She began shouting, her voice cracking, claiming jurisdictional overreach and legal malpractice. She pointed at the rulebook, now uselessly clutched in the hand of the security guard. Her outburst, captured clearly on video, was her public humiliation. She was exposed as a petty tyrant, not a protector of community standards, fighting not for order, but for a twisted sense of control. The very power structure she had created, one that relied on rigid conformity and legalistic intimidation, was being dismantled in real time on the sidewalk, for all her neighbors to see. The humiliation was total because her ultimate weapon, the rulebook, was suddenly powerless. The security detail, realizing they were now illegally obstructing a state investigation, lowered their clipboards and retreated sheepishly to their vehicles. The black SUV and the white pickup left the quiet community as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Eleanor alone, defeated, on the curb. Alex stood by the pit, watching the state archaeologist carefully begin her work. The artifacts were safe. The house was safe. The silence that fell over Willow Creek was different now. It was a silence of vindication, of power being returned. But the emotional toll was heavy. While Alex had won the battle, the war on principle and the trauma of the confrontation would forever change their quiet life. The struggle was over, but the impact, the realization of what this confrontation meant for every homeowner trapped under the thumb of an overzealous HOA, was just beginning to settle in. Trophy: the fall of the paper tyrant. The retreat of the private security vehicles left behind a profound, almost unbelievable silence. It wasn't the manufactured quiet of Willow Creek's perfect suburban aesthetic, but the silence of a siege broken. Dr. Reed, the state archaeologist, moved with quiet, focused professionalism, her presence now the undeniable shield against any further local aggression. The ground that had been a site of domestic argument was now a protected historical zone, its fate elevated far beyond the scope of local regulations. The immediate relief was immense, a physical decompression. The HOA's last gasp effort to seize the discovery had failed, not because of a counter-rule, but because of a superior moral and legal authority. The immediate, satisfying fallout was the nullification of every single fine. Clara, the archaeological lawyer, ensured that the official state declaration of the site's significance retroactively wiped the slate clean. Every $500 daily fine, every $100 citation for dust, every $250 penalty for the surveillance camera, they vanished like smoke. This reversal of financial oppression was perhaps the single most visceral moment of triumph. The weapon Eleanor had used to batter Alex into submission had been turned back into meaningless paper. The crumbling throne. The true, long-term impact was not measured in artifacts or fines, but in the shift of community dynamics. Eleanor, the architect of the absurdity, found her authority utterly dissolved. The neighbors who had previously tolerated, or even silently encouraged, her rigid enforcement now saw her not as a guardian of property values, but as a petty tyrant who had nearly bankrupted a fellow homeowner over dirt and history. The public confrontation, witnessed by the news crew and several residents, became the undeniable truth. Whispers replaced silence. Emails about manicured lawns were ignored in favor of urgent, frantic discussion threads demanding accountability. For years, the residents had lived under a system of learned helplessness, accepting the tyranny of the covenants as the cost of a perfect suburb. Alex's fight, born out of a simple archaeological discovery, had unintentionally struck a blow for every homeowner who had ever been fined for an unapproved paint color or an improperly stored trash can. The momentum became unstoppable. A rarely used provision was invoked, calling for an emergency general meeting of all dues-paying homeowners. The air in the community clubhouse that evening was electric, thick with the scent of fear and long-suppressed resentment. Eleanor arrived, attempting to stand firm behind the formality of procedure, but the ground beneath her had become as unstable as the excavated earth in Alex's backyard. One by one, homeowners who had suffered under her regime, silent victims of fines for unraked leaves or bird feeders, stood up, their voices no longer meek, but resolute. They didn't speak of the artifacts. They spoke of the abuse of power, the relentless, soul-crushing pettiness. They had seen the true cost of her control. The vote was a landslide, a collective act of catharsis. Eleanor's reign was over. She was removed from the board, not by an outside entity, but by the very community she sought to control. She left the clubhouse alone, walking back into the perfectly manicured anonymity of Willow Creek, stripped of the power that had defined her existence. The victory felt complete, not just for Alex, but for the soul of the neighborhood, the scar and the legacy. In the months that followed, the consequences settled in. A newly elected, much more moderate HOA board immediately moved to revise the covenants. The obscure clause about subsurface materials was formally deleted. The document, once Eleanor's weapon, was reformed into a set of sensible guidelines, stripped of its capacity for arbitrary enforcement. It was a tedious, procedural process, but it solidified the lasting impact of the conflict. The system itself had been forced to bend toward reason. The archaeological site work continued for several weeks. Alex watched as the careful, quiet professionals sifted through the soil, cataloging the remnants of a life lived centuries before the Willow Creek subdivision was even conceived. It was a profound connection to the past, one purchased at the price of immense personal stress. Eventually, the artifacts, now properly dated, documented, and given a collective name reflecting their provenance, were transferred to a state museum. Alex insisted they be accessible, a testament to the land's deep history, far outweighing the shallow history of the HOA. The long-term impact on Alex was a curious duality. Their house, now the most famous and contentious in Willow Creek, became a marker. They were simultaneously the quiet hero who deposed the HOA tyrant and the permanent outlier who dared to disrupt the perfect suburban illusion. The initial dream of quiet, peaceful living was gone forever, replaced by an uneasy celebrity. The backyard was eventually filled, graded, and replanted. Yet, Alex never looked at the lawn the same way. There was a memory there, a permanent scar beneath the surface where history had risen to the challenge the present. The discovery was no longer a secret. It was a legacy. The biggest takeaway, the ultimate resolution to the entire ordeal, was this. The artifacts proved that the land was ancient, wild, and belonged to no single authority. The conflict proved that the HOA rules were only as powerful as the collective willingness of the community to enforce them. When one homeowner refused to submit to the absurd, they exposed the terrifying fragility of petty tyranny. The book of rules was heavy, but the weight of history, and the determination of one person standing their ground was heavier. The ultimate question remains, long after the artifacts are placed behind glass and the fines are forgotten. In your own quiet neighborhood, what secret might be buried beneath your lawn, and are you prepared for the price of unearthing it? Because the moment you find something truly valuable, you will discover exactly who truly owns your land, and how quickly they will come to claim it.